Welcome to this invasive species primer module. This information was adapted from a Wisconsin First Detectors Network training session. On this recording, you will hear Tony Summers and Mark Renz give an overview of invasive species. In this video, you will learn what invasive species means, the biology behind them, and impacts that they have on the environment. We will end with several examples of how invasives have impacted Wisconsin. For additional training, please visit our website.
So what we're going to cover in the invasive species primer, first of all, what's in a name? Turns out there's quite a bit, especially us scientists. We like to have our definitions lined up. So we're going to talk about a few basic terms. And then we're going to talk a little bit about invasion as a process. You know, it's not just a static state. How does it work? And finally, you know, what happens as a result of invasion? So how do invasives cause change? And we'll take any questions that you have throughout the process. So what's in a name? Most of you have probably heard many of these terms, and a lot of times they're used interchangeably with the word invasive. And it turns out that kind of does a little bit of a disservice to the term invasive and to these terms, and it causes a lot of confusion. So I'm going to go over a little bit about what these terms mean and what it means to be invasive, and so that everybody's kind of coming from the same starting point of understanding. So the term invasive, it's, you know, we're a primarily plant group here, but it can also apply to insects, animals, diseases. There are even invasive mushrooms out there. Basically, it can be any living organism, for the most part, could potentially be invasive somewhere. One of the key components is that it is not native to whatever region it is being considered in. Native status typically for us in North America is determined by whether or not it was present before European contact. And it's kind of an arbitrary term on one level, but it also kind of makes sense on another level because species really started moving around the globe much faster after European contact. So we kind of use it as a benchmark. It's important to note here that here in Wisconsin, you could have an invasive species that is native to the United States or even part of the Midwest, as long as it wasn't native to this particular location before European contact. It can still be considered an invasive species, and a classic example of that is black locust, which is native to the southeastern United States. Another important component of invasives is they must be increasing in their population size and spreading into new locations. So not only is it existing, but it is increasing in abundance. And then as it increases, it must also cause some type of harm. So it's harming either biodiversity, ecosystem function, economy, agriculture, human health, recreation. Basically, if it's causing any measurable harm, we would consider it to be an invasive species, as long as it meets the other criteria as well as being non-native and spreading. So the speech, or the definition I like to use for invasive species, it's a non-native species that is increasing in abundance and causing impact to the environment, economy, and or human health. I guess you could modify that slightly to say it's causing, or it is believed to cause, or has the potential to cause. So there are species that aren't causing impacts yet, but we suspect that they will in the future, and those fit that definition of invasive species as well. This little chart here is just a little handy reference. So you'll notice that you have categories of native, weed, alien, and invasive, and they have different characteristics. I chose Wisconsin here. So you can have a native plant, obviously grows in Wisconsin, and weeds can, and aliens can, invasives can. And you can look through it and see what some of the differences are in those different categories. All right, I just wanted to go over a couple examples because we get the term weed a lot of times used interchangeably with invasive. So I pulled out an example here of a native weed, giant ragweed. It's a weed in agriculture, a lot of disturbed areas, probably not a big garden weed, but I could see it growing in a garden. It's also a pretty common allergen, so it has an impact on humans. However, it's a native plant, so it can't fit that definition of invasive. So you can refer to this as a weedy species, and you can hate it, and you can pull it out and do whatever, but it's not going to fit that qualification of invasive.
Yeah, and Tony, if I can chime in, what's interesting about this plant, it is actively invading Europe, and they're really concerned about giant and common ragweed in Europe because of the allergies. And so it's kind of unique how, well, the native plants over here, it's an invasive in Europe.
That's an interesting point, Mark. Thanks for bringing that up. It's important to note, too, that we have a lot of plants native to the U.S. that are causing problems in different parts of the world. So even though we have our suite of invasives that we're dealing with, you know, we give as good as we get, I guess, in that sense. Here's an example of a non-native plant. Obviously, this is corn. It's a desirable crop species. However, it's not invasive because it's not going to persist without human intervention. So if we stop fertilizing, if we stop watering it, well, probably not watering it, but if we stop fertilizing it and planting it and maintaining the fields, this plant would disappear. Therefore, it doesn't fit the qualification of invasive species. This one's a little bit trickier. This is Timothy. This is a non-native plant that we call naturalized. It's naturalized because it's able to survive on its own without much human intervention, maybe beyond the introduction, the original introduction. However, it's not spreading. Therefore, we don't classify it as invasive. So even though it's a little bit trickier and a little bit of a gray area, this one really is not considered to be an invasive species. And finally, this is probably one many of you are familiar with, garlic mustard. It's a classic invasive plant. It comes in, it takes over in a lot of forest understories, crowds out native plants, causes changes in the soil chemistry, causes change in mycorrhizal fungi, creates what we call monospecific stands, which means nothing else is growing there. And it creates kind of what we call a desert of biodiversity. So the only thing you find growing with it are a few insects maybe that are able to survive on either the leaves or by pollinating the plant. So there really isn't much diversity there compared to what you would find in a native-dominated forest understory. All right. So that concludes talking about terms. We're going to switch over a little bit and talk about the invasion process. And this is one of the most important concepts that we can consider when we're talking about invasives. It really is not just a snapshot of what we see our snapshot in time, but really it's a process. So where we were 5 years ago, where we are now, where we will be in the future, that is the invasion process that we have to start to think about. Typically, it occurs in a few different phases. The first being the introduction, and this can be a single plant or a single organism that's brought to a location, or it can be multiple introductions, and certain species require one or potentially multiple introductions in order to take hold. During this period, you get a strong amount of genetic selection, so you bring in something from far away, it adapts to the new conditions, and goes through what we call a lag period, where it sticks around at a low level, but it doesn't really spread, it doesn't really cause much, or doesn't really raise much cause for concern. And once everything is right, you've got the right number of individuals, you have the right genetics, maybe you get 1 or 2 favorable years climate-wise put together, and you move from the introduction and lag period into the expansion phase. And the expansion phase, you'll notice, is that period where you start to get rapid growth. And really typically, as you'll notice with this arrow here, detection typically happens sort of early on in that rapid expansion phase. And then the rate of that expansion really is very much dependent on species biology. How many propagules or seeds, how many offspring does it have? Obviously, certain slow reproducing species are going to do this a little bit more slowly, but they're all going to go through this rapid period of expansion. And then finally, after it does its thing, it'll sort of start to level off, and you'll reach what we call the carrying capacity, where the limit for how much of that species we can have starts to get reached. And really, once that happens, there's not a lot you can do to get rid of the species once it reaches there. I'm going to go through, I'm going to use emerald ash borer as an example. Many of you are probably familiar with this species, but you know, this point that we have here on the map is the original emerald ash borer introduction point into Detroit in 2002. It came in on untreated pallet wood. And if you looked at this in 2002, maybe even 2003, 2004, 2005, we knew it was there, but we didn't know how big of a problem it was. And so it was going through, you know, probably kind of a lag period, or at least not a very noticeable rapid expansion. However, if we flash forward about 12 years, you look at the map here, you can see that it's as far west as Colorado here, and down into Georgia to the south. It's up into Canada up here. It really has rapidly spread and taken over. So this is one of those things where we knew it was a problem, and you can really see how fast it did spread. We have evidence across different taxa. We have evidence of massively different lag periods for different invasive species. So emerald ash borer was invasive pretty much immediately. We have evidence of western invasive cheatgrass after about 20 years. Hill mustard here in Wisconsin about 40 years. And red sea mussel is the winner so far at 120 years or so from the first recorded case until it was reported to be invasive. Okay. So this is just a slide. I wanted to go right into the example. So again, this just talks a little bit about the lag phase. So if you look at a study here of 257 potentially invasive plants in the Midwest, about 3/4 of them exhibited a lag phase, and the average was about 47 years. So it can take quite a while.
But again, the key point is it's highly variable. And I think that's important to remember when looking at some of these invasives. So if we see something and it's not behaving invasive, it doesn't mean that it may not become invasive at some point in the future.
Perfect. Okay, so I showed you the graph, and just to go back to the biological invasions, one of the reasons we're starting to see a lot more of it in the last 30 years or so, 30 to 40 years, is we're increasing our rate of global homogenization, and that is sort of relates to that slide that Mark brought up with imports and exports. The more we move things around the world, the more we're going to introduce new pest species. And just sort of to clarify, by definition, invasive species require some type of human dispersal to get to a new area. So typically, if you can document that a new species comes into an area by a natural event, it wouldn't be considered invasive. However, the odds of that happening, they're so tiny in comparison to the new number of species that come in by human-assisted events. I'd say way, way, way less than even 1/10% of new species introductions are natural. Invasion is a process, not a state. So as we mentioned, it can take months or centuries from introduction to noticeable problem. Again, if you have even a known invasive, say even on your property or a local park or some area that you visit, and you see 3 or 4 individuals of that species, and it doesn't seem like it's a problem, you may be right, but it also is very possible that that they will be in the future. If you flash forward 10 years into the future, 15, 20, could be a major impact. And again, the impacts of invasives, they cause what we call a ripple effect through an ecosystem. So as they come in and they start taking up more space, they're pushing other species out that would occupy those roles and those resources. And then those species that depend on those species that got removed have impacts. And so we have this ripple effect. I like to think of it as the most intricate game of Jenga that's out there. So this is an area of a lot of discussion about why species become invasive, and there are many, many, many theories, and in some cases, specific examples of one of these factors becoming very important. But a lot of times what you have is you bring a species to a new location, and they don't have things that eat them. They don't have diseases that infect them in their new area. And so they're able to do much better. They have a common disease in their native habitat that kind of keeps them from spreading. Or there's a predator or herbivore that eats them and keeps them in check. You move them to a new location and those may not be present. Purple loosestrife is an example. And purple loosestrife is one where we've introduced a predator, or I guess it's a predator because it's a beetle, that comes in. We've introduced that biocontrol agent to keep that plant in check. So we've brought over its Achilles heel to the Midwest to help deal with this plant. Oftentimes, invasives are also able to occupy an area or use a resource not used by native species. And examples that we talk about sometimes are buckthorn or bush honeysuckle being able to exploit that role of the, forest mid-story that's not heavily used by a lot of native species. Also, and kind of along the same lines, they've also been evolved to be more competitive than native species. So you could put those under that category as well. But for whatever reason, either the area that they come from is more highly competitive and they come here and it's not as competitive, or they're just better adapted to the local system than some of the native species. They can become invasive. And Phragmites or common reed is a good example of that. It's a wetland grass. One of the important things to talk about is combination of invasiveness and invasibility. So invasiveness is a trait that's possessed by a species, and you can think of it as an index score of 0 to 100. So 100 being the perfect invasive organism, and it can get certain points for things like producing a lot of offspring, or being poisonous to being eaten, or having spines for defense, or not being able to be pulled from the ground. The sum of those inherent biological properties gives it a score that increases or decreases its likeliness of becoming invasive. And invasibility, the flip side of that, is a trait possessed by a habitat. So the same way as species have the sum of these biological scores, ecosystems and habitats do as well. So a species without, a habitat with a lot of disturbance is more open to being invaded. An area with a lot of flooding, frequent fires, low diversity or abundance of native species. These types of things increase the ease at which a habitat is invaded by a species. So it's important to kind of think about these two terms and to put them both in context. So this is important if you're a land manager or concerned with preserving land. If you can do things to reduce the invasibility of that land, you're going to have better success at keeping it in the state that you want. So reducing the disturbance on that land is a good thing, typically. Okay, so moving on to how invasive species cause change. There are a bunch of different ways. Probably some of the two main ones are direct competition. So anytime you have a thing living somewhere, something else is not able to live in that location or use those resources. So resource competition and direct competition is the main way. I'll talk a little bit about that on the next slide. Another is altering succession, and succession is an important thing to talk about, and I'll do so in another slide as well. They can also change environmental parameters, so invasives can change soil chemistry, they can increase soil nitrogen, acidity, things like that. They can alter fire frequency, change the water availability, increase or decrease erosion. There's also other factors, I'm sure, but those are some of the most common ones. And it's also possible for an invasive species to bring along another invasive species with it. So in the picture of the raccoon here on the right, I know an example from one of the California Channel Islands that didn't have raccoons living on it. You get a raccoon that comes over on a private boat. It hops over onto the shore, brings with it a strain of canine distemper, which is transmitted to one of the local endemic fox species. And you have nearly wiped out endemic fox species. This happened in the late 90s on Catalina Island off of California. And so they nearly had the species go extinct because of an introduction of raccoons that brought along a secondary disease with it. And this is the story you can read about. I know National Geographic just had a story on this recently. All right, and so direct competition. Invasive species are competing with resources along with the natives. Resource availability is ultimately what shapes the landscape. You can think about this is why deserts don't have a lot of green plants on them. If you have any new species occupying space, it prevents something else from existing in that space. It's the simplest way to think about it. Invasive species are often better at resource exploitation, and that's the reason why they become invasive. Succession, I mentioned this. You can think of it as the unidirectional change in species composition over time in a plant community following a disturbance. You can debate this term, but the details of it, but we know that this does happen. If you think of the example of a tornado coming in and blowing down a section of forest, you can watch this happen. You get grass and first colonizer, small species coming in first. After a few years, you can get tree seedlings starting to get a few feet tall, and you get shrubs coming in. Those give way to shrubs and saplings, tree saplings being some of the dominant species. And then finally, you get mature trees and then limited understory being sort of what we call the climax composition of a forest. Well, when you introduce invasive species into the mix, they can actually halt that process at any stage in it. So if you have a dominant invasive grass coming in, you can prevent trees and shrubs from starting their process and taking over. Or if you have a dominant tree or shrub coming in, or an invasive tree or shrub, you can prevent the mature native forest canopy from coming in. So if you have things like bush honeysuckle or European buckthorn, you might not have your maple-dominated hardwood forest. You might just get a 10 to 15 foot tall, scrubby bush honeysuckle European buckthorn forest. And we know that communities held at the community then would be held at an early to mid-successional state. And we know that the highest species diversity tends to be late successional. So your greatest amount of insect and bird and animal diversity really is in those climax type of forest habitat. So by most accounts, this is a bad thing to have in a forest or in any landscape. Is artificially held at an early successional state. All right, I'm going to go through just a couple of real quick examples of some classic invasive species. Many of you are probably familiar with the common starling. It was introduced from Europe in about 1860, and they introduced 60 birds to New York City at that time, and we're up to an estimated 150 million in North America right now. And these birds cause an estimated $800 million in damage to U.S. agriculture each year. And this was all because someone wanted to recreate the birds of Shakespeare's plays here in the U.S. They brought about 40 different species over, I think. And this is one of the ones that took off. Classic disease example is chestnut blight. Native to Asia and rapidly spread to most of the green area on the map here in only about 40 years. And it basically effectively eradicated a once dominant tree species from its natural landscape. You may know American chestnut, it's not completely eradicated, but if you don't treat it with chemicals to keep it safe, it'll only grow to be about finger width in diameter before it gets infected by chestnut blight. It's still out there. So you get a lot of these really resprouting plants, but it's not nothing like its former glory was.
This concludes the Invasive Species Primer module. We here at WIFDN hope you learned from it and want to thank you for watching.